Welcome. My name is Nadia El-Haj. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University, and we're very pleased to be hosting this session today, which is part of our library series. We have our guests are the editors and or contributors to a recently published book, When Politics Are Sacralized: Comparative Perspectives on Religious Claims and Nationalism. I'm going to briefly introduce the three speakers, and after they each give their presentations, I'll make a few comments and open the conversation amongst the panelists. And after we've had some conversation, we'll have time for Q&A from the audience. Please remember, if you have questions, to post it into the Q&A section on at the bottom of your screens. Okay, so as I said, welcome. This volume, When Politics Are Sacralized, is edited by two very prominent Palestinian scholars, Nadim Rouhana and Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, both of whom are here today. I'm going to start by introducing our speakers, as I said, and then go from there. So Nadim Rouhana is Professor of International Affairs and Conflict Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He works on conflict studies and international negotiation, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and Israeli and Palestinian societies, the dynamics of protracted social conflict, collective identity, and democratic citizenship in multi-ethnic states, settler colonialism, and questions of reconciliation and transitional justice. His recent books include Israel and its Palestinian Citizens, Ethnic Privileges in the Jewish State, and the Palestinians in Israel, Readings in History, Politics, and Society. And as I mentioned, he is one of the editors of the volume we are discussing today. The second editor, who is also with us, is Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who is the Lawrence D. Beale Chair in Law at the Faculty of Law Institute of Criminology and the School of Social Work and Public Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's also the Global Chair in Law at Queen Mary University in London. Her research focuses on trauma, straight crimes and criminology, surveillance, gender violence, law, and society. She studies the crime of femicide and other forms of gender-based violence, violence against children in conflict-ridden areas, crimes of abuse of power in settler colonial contexts, surveillance, securitization, and social control. Her recent books include Incarcerated Childhood and the Politics of Unchilding, and the edited volume, Understanding Campus Community Partnerships in Conflict Zones, Engaging Students for Transformative Change. And finally, I would like to introduce David Lloyd, who is one of the contributors to the volume. David Lloyd is Distinguished Professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, and has worked primarily on Irish culture and on post-colonial and cultural theory. He teaches courses on Irish literature, poetry, and poetics, and post-colonial and settler colonial cultural studies. He is the author of numerous books, including Irish Times, Temporalities of Modernity, Irish Culture and Colonial Modernity, 1800 to 2000, The Transformation of Oral Space, and Underrepresentation, the Racial Regime of Aesthetics. I would like to welcome all of you and hand the floor or the screen over to Nadim, who will begin.
First, I'd like to thank the Center for Palestine Studies for organizing this event, and the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life for co-sponsoring it. I would like also to thank Nadia very much for moderating the event and for you all for attending. I'd like first to say a word about the book project. This project was led by my colleague, as Nadia said, by my colleague and friend Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian and myself. Our initial interest in this project emerged from our research and personal involvement in the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and our observations of its historical evolution. We came to this project not as scholars of religion and nationalism per se, but more as involved scholars in a conflict in which the intertwining between religious claims and nationalism are transforming its dynamics and bringing to the fore the very clear settler colonial practices and policies all over Palestine. While mainstream discourse across the globe often invokes religion as a major reason for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the majority of Israelis and Palestinians have historically understood the conflict as fundamentally secular in nature, either national or settler colonial, mainly on the Palestinian side, and also, as you know, it's becoming, the settler colonial paradigm is becoming a dominant paradigm or a central paradigm in the international academic scene. For Zionism, it wasn't initially perceived as national or certainly not as settler colonial in the sense we talk about now. It was construed as a conflict of liberating Eretz Yisrael, read Palestine, from foreigners without necessarily bestowing on them the status of nation. Yet in the past few decades, the apparent invocation of religious claims and interpretations and the role of religious players in the conflict have been on the rise. Zionism, of course, is not the only state ideology on the international scene that seeks religious legitimation for ethnic or settler colonial policies. The question of similarities and the impact on global policies, therefore, brought us to our comparative project. I should say that this comparative project from the start was supported generously by the Henry Luce Foundation until its fruition. And it made it possible for us to focus on a number of cases worldwide, in addition to the Israeli case. So we have examined India, Iran, Northern Ireland, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Serbia, and Sri Lanka. Obviously, I mean, as you will see from David's presentation, the Northern Irish case is a completely different case in which religion might be invoked, but it's not a central component. So let's see what we are doing here. We think that scholarly discussions on the relationship between religion and nationalism and the emergence of secularization paradigm and its critique have been exhaustive. The views that divorce nationalism from religion, reject the possibility that religious elements are integrated in nationalism, or consider nationalism as modernity's total replacement of religion, have long been challenged in the literature on religion and nationalism. We don't repeat that. We only share the argument that has been broadly accepted in the post-colonial literature that secularists and Eurocentric biases have shaped the view that nationalism replaced religion and became distinctive category, as also highlighted by some contributors to this volume. Yet we have a very important question. Okay, we accept that. But while we accept this view, we also concur with the argument that there remains the case that the fundamental point of reference of nationalist policies is the nation, and that political claims are made in the name of the nation and its distinctive doctrine of sources of legitimacy and political authority, and that is the state. So what stands at the center of our inquiry is the impact of the intertwining, particularly when religious claims or nationalism are fused to the extent that religious claims bestow sacredness on the state's working of power and the modalities of its operation. So, there's enormous work on the intertwining between religion and nationalism. What the new thing that we think we are, the new perspective we bring tries to answer a very important question. That question was raised by Roger Brubaker in one of his discussions of this issue. What counts as religious message and imagery as opposed to religiously tinged or originally religious, but subsequently secularized language and imagery? In other words, what's new about Zionism or similar ideologies? Isn't our interpretation of that, of the extent of religious involvement and imagery, subjective? And our answer goes to the heart of our concern and sidesteps the possible problematics of subjective interpretations. What counts as fusion in our mind is when religion and religious claims interact with nationalism in ways that are used to publicly frame or legitimize the state's political ideologies, policies, decisions, and its governance. This is why, in our view, when it comes to the impact of religious claims on state policies, lumping all cases of nationalism together by arguing that all nationalisms have religious influence misses a potentially major theoretical input. It leads to overlooking cases in which religious claims or the invocation of religious texts and interpretations have a vital hold on nationalism in ways that become apparent in framing state policies. A distinctive feature of the state in such cases, as detailed in our work, is sacralizing politics embedded in religious claims and sacred religious texts. Our analysis seeks to examine how, through hegemonic nationalism, states invoke religious claims as being foundational for political and national claims in domestic and international politics. Thus, it's sacralizing the political. This sacralization bestowed the certainty of religious sanctification, even when invoked by non-religious and secular actors, as in Zionism, right? Secular actors are invoking the sacred text. The emphasis on state policies in this regard is important because, as we show in our volume, states' reliance often explicitly on religious claims or texts for justifying and legitimizing contentious policies is on the rise, although it's rather the non-state actors that have occupied political attention and certainly the attention of the academic world. The academic world, academic research, you have so much work on the non-state actors when state actors are by and large neglected. The concept of sacralized politics has been almost exclusively reserved to secular politics in the sense of conferring religious-like forms and significance, but not religious legitimation to the political. What I'm trying to say is that sacralization of the secular has been used in political discourse. But the sacralization of the secular, the leader, the ideology, and the practice is not equivalent to religion. What we are bringing here, it's precisely here that our intervention seeks to revert to the original meaning of religious sacralization and investigate how religious claims, sacred text, confers sacredness in this original sense to the policies of state and how they bring to the forefront the invocation of religious legitimation of such policies. Our emphasis on sacralization, by which we mean religious legitimation or framing of official state policies, is an effort to contribute to highlighting the dangerous impact of sacralization of national and international politics. Nadera will present the modalities through which state implements sacralized politics. I want to make some observations on the case of Zionism and the increasing religious legitimation. Religious legitimation is actually being used consciously or without planning to obscure settler colonial Israel. Settler colonial project, the whole project from start until now. The religious national support for the settlement project is unquestionable. it has forceful roots, as we know, in the openly religious Zionist discourse. But in my mind, the direct or indirect blaming of religious nationalism or religious parties is self-serving misplacement of responsibility from Zionism as a settler colonial project to just these religious parties. It's the convergence of the religious with the settler colonial and their interdependence that make both rise concurrently. Religious nationalism supports the settlement project and pushes towards expanding it. Secular Zionism in its settler colonial project increasingly needs the legitimation, and that legitimation it finds in the religious text. I want just to give you one clarification without going into details about this point. Let's imagine that Herzl's proposal to establish a Jewish homeland in Uganda, or for that matter in other places, Argentina or Australia and so on, as was discussed in the Sixth Zionist Congress, was accepted. Now, if it were to be done in Uganda, I'll say that very briefly, it would have developed as a white settler colonial project in the heart of Africa or somewhere else, right? Israel in Uganda would be like other white settler colonial. It would have been deprived of a source of claiming legitimacy except for what settler colonial projects proclaim, right? So it would have been fought, and that decolonization would be going on, and then there is no way to go to the religious text. It's in Palestine that the religious text is going, that Zionism is going to, and it's Palestine that they have to go to. They have to go to because their legitimacy is being challenged. Now, I want here to also talk about the role of the Palestinians briefly and end with that in influencing Zionism and makes it really forcing it in a way to go that way. So a major determinant in the rise of the religious dimension of Zionism is Palestinian agency and resistance, right? So the more Palestinians resist, the more Palestinians hold against giving legitimacy to this project, the more the project has to find some source of legitimation. And here, just in a word, I also make a distinction in the settler and settler colonial studies, if some people are interested in that, that it's true that that settler colonialism is a structure, and it's true that it's not an event, and it's true that it's an invasion, is a structure, not just one event of going into a land. But I think settler colonial studies really miss, and with this I want to end because I noticed that my time is, I approach the end of allocated time. I think settler colonialism ignores the question of process and the place of the indigenous population in forcing the ideology to change root. And my example is that the Palestinian agency and resistance and holding about not giving legitimacy in all segments of the Palestinian nation, most prominently inside Israel itself, with with the political ideologies that emerged, is forcing Zionism to go into that direction. And I'm talking about Zionism as a whole, including secular Zionism and not only religious branches of Zionism. I end with that, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nadim. I think David is going next. So I hand it.
Thank you, Nadia. And let me also begin by thanking the Center for Palestine Studies for hosting us today, and to thank you for the work you do every day and not just today. It's absolutely crucial at this time. And I, among many others, are very glad that the Center for Palestine Studies exists and does this work. And I also want to extend my congratulations to Nadera and Nadim, not for the first time, on the publication of When Politics Are Sacralized. It's an enormously important project. We're going to focus, I think, today on the question of Palestine, but it, as Nadim has said, covers many other sites of conflict that masquerade or are predicated upon religion. And I'm here partly because my work both touches in this essay in the book on Palestine while really focusing on Northern Ireland. And I confess what I already confessed long ago to Nadim and to Nadera, that I was very hesitant to participate in this, first the conference and then the book, because my work is not sociological. It's certainly not religious studies, and it's certainly not sociology of religion. And so I wasn't quite sure how I could contribute in a very meaningful way to a book on the sacralization of politics. Thinking further, however, and since I have over the last 10 years often thought of Ireland via Palestine and Palestine via Ireland, I realized that there were actually several rationales for participating in this book. The first was the constancy with which throughout the 30 years of the recent troubles, as they're euphemistically called in Northern Ireland, the phrase Belfast to Beirut would come up over and over again in comparative terrorism studies and comparative conflict studies and so forth. But since around 1995 and the beginnings of what's become known as the Northern Irish peace process, that phrase transformed into from Belfast to Bethlehem, with the idea that rather than being an exemplar of conflict, Northern Ireland would become an exemplar of peace processes. And I wanted to put some pressure on the applicability of that notion of the Northern Irish peace process as a generalizable model onto the question of a potential peace process that we are constantly told is on the table between Israel and Palestine. The second rationale for me was, I suppose, autobiographical. I begin my essay with an anecdote about an experience I had as a young schoolboy going to a boarding school in Belfast, where as a Protestant from the south of Ireland, I was suddenly confronted by a very different kind of Protestantism in Belfast that expressed itself very clearly in supremacist terms, though that was not a vocabulary that I had at the time. I had to be taught as a Protestant from the south what it was to be a supremacist, and therefore what the nature of the enemy of supremacism, the Catholic nationalist, actually was. And I go into some detail in the essay about the preposterous projection of racial characteristics onto Catholic Northern Irish people, which anthropologists recognize as a form of what they call telling in Northern Ireland, interpretation of signs. But it was many, many years later that I first walked through occupied East Jerusalem in Nadera's company. And Nadera may remember how struck I was by the extraordinary, uncanny relation between what I had experienced in Northern Ireland as Protestant triumphalism and the very manifest triumphalism of Jewish settlers in East Jerusalem at the time. This is, of course, something that anybody who's been to Belfast will perhaps not be entirely surprised by, since all Protestant pubs are decorated with flags, the Union Jack alongside the Star of David, just as many Catholic or nationalist pubs in nationalist regions are decorated with the tricolor and the flag of Palestine. But settler triumphalism was, for me as a Protestant from the South, though I couldn't have theorized it at the time, a strange experience. It was the oddity of the difference between two very proximate Irish Protestant experiences. One of a gradual integration into what was first the Free State and then the Republic of Ireland, reluctant at first, but gradually imperceptible. And the other, on the northern side of the border, the partition imposed upon us, what was manifestly, and again, I didn't have the terms at the time to describe it as such, a settler colonial entity. What I would theorize now as settler mentalities in Northern Ireland, I argue in the book, are the effect not of any kind of naturalization of religious difference as such, but of the use of religion fusing with a politics of what I could think of as settler nationalism in a structure in dominance. In other words, religion had no meaning, and indeed Protestantism itself had no meaning except in the institutional forms that were put in place as a result of the partition in order to maintain what was frankly termed a Protestant state for a Protestant people throughout the history of Northern Ireland. What Nadim has been calling the fusion of nationalism and religion, however, in Northern Ireland took place in a kind of reverse way, which was the secularization of what might have been sacred Protestant doctrine into a civic religion, in the sense that in the history of British Protestantism, that adopted by Northern Irish loyalists or unionists, had morphed into a kind of civic claim that Protestantism represented the capacity for civil society that Catholicism, with its dogmatism and its subservience to authority, was incapable of manifesting. So that in Northern Ireland, the conflict was understood by the settler as a conflict between civil society and authoritarianism, dogmatism, and so forth. Deep contradictions clearly emerged from that, since supremacism could only be maintained by its own forms of discrimination that utterly undermined civil society as such, and by forms of authoritarianism which were necessary to maintain a regime predicated on absolute forms of discrimination. In that case, where we had a settler colony which formed almost a perfect laboratory for settler colonialism in certain ways, precisely insofar as Northern Ireland was a declarative, or if you like, performative entity produced artificially in order to maintain that structure in dominance. How could a peace process that had taken place at the end of a long conflict in Northern Ireland, and here I would absolutely concur with what Nadim was just saying about the necessity for us to understand the ways in which the resistance of the colonized transforms the nature of settler ideology, whether religious or otherwise. How would a peace process that took place under those conditions be translatable to Palestine? As indeed many have claimed. Many have put up this model of the Northern Irish peace process as one for moving peace process forward in Palestine. What, in other words, would settler decolonization look like through the lens of what had happened in Northern Ireland? Now, of course, at the heart of this idea that Northern Ireland might offer a model for other peace processes elsewhere is the idea that the peace process overcame intransigence on both sides, but in particular the intransigence of a Protestant population committed to the maintenance of its privileges and the maintenance of the ties with Britain at the expense of complete equality with their Catholic and nationalist co-citizens. If you like, we could even say that Northern Ireland exemplifies the failure of a two-state solution. It was an interim project designed to mollify the wounded sensibilities of Protestants in Ireland by offering them their own little state in which they could further their own ideals and their own political arrangements. However, that process, as sociologists of the Northern Irish peace process recognize, could not take place just by the cultivation of goodwill of the Protestants towards their Catholic and nationalist co-citizens. On the contrary, what made the Good Friday Agreement, which inaugurated the peace process, possible, according to Brendan O'Leary and other experts on the process, was exogamous pressure. What they meant by that was that the process could only take place so long as the British government, then under Tony Blair, and the US government, then under Bill Clinton, actually placed pressure on both sides, but in particular on the unionist population, to come to the table. In other words, external support of transformation was absolutely essential. The question with which I end my essay in the book, which I think is extremely pertinent to today's discussion, is what would supply that exogenous pressure in the case of Israel? It's clear that, like any settler colony, as Memi articulated many, many years ago, requires for its existence the support of something that stands in for a mother country. In the case of Northern Irish Protestants, that was clearly the British, whom they never trusted to fulfill that mission. In the case of Israel, of course, the only power that occupies that position now is the United States. But it has become obvious to us that in the case of the United States, there has been and is unlikely to be no movement towards placing serious and meaningful exogenous pressure on Israel. Hence, I argue at the end, the absolute importance of the civil society movement. Just as South Africa made no moves toward the ending of apartheid under the conditions of Reaganite congagement, as the phrase then was, so Israel is clearly going to make no moves towards internal decolonization without the pressure of an exogenous actor that will delegitimize the project of Zionism. Accordingly, I argue at the moment, BDS is the only exogenous actor that furnishes any such pressure. And I think the gains of the last 15 years or so show us that pressure has gradually moved things. And we can go back to Nadim to see how it has also transformed Zionism on its path to greater and greater rigor and rigidity, if you like. Again, something that Memi predicted in The Colonizer and the Colonized as a fundamental dynamic of any settler colony, its gradual move towards further and further authoritarianism, and in fact, as he says, to fascism. So my thinking about the model of the peace process of Northern Ireland for Palestine in particular is, I would say, pessimistic without that exogenous actor that BDS supplies in the current situation. Whether or not it supplies a model for other places, I wouldn't venture to say, but I'll leave it there, and perhaps we can discuss this further after Nadera has spoken. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Nadera, you are up.
Yeah. Thank you, David. And thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Layla, and all the wonderful souls at the Center for Palestine Studies. And I want really again to thank the Luz Foundation, mainly Dr. Toby Volkman, for her insightful engagement with us and for her generous support. Let me take you to our analysis, because our analysis in our book really seek to examine how, through hegemonic nationalism, states invoke religious claims as being foundational for political and national claims in domestic and international politics, thus sacralizing the political. In many cases of the fusion between religious claims and nationalism that we study in our volume, like Zionism, like the Hindutva, the religious substance not only shapes and highlights the distinctiveness of the group's identity, history, and destiny, the fusion of the two also provides the state with nationalism that integrates the vitality of foundational sacred texts, the assertion that the land is sacred both in its political and religious sense, the religion-national collective myth and symbols, and the very legitimation for states' policy derived from religious claims embedded in this fusion. Now, the nuances of the political impact of religious claims in these and in other sites are not put always into productive conversation with one another. And this is what this volume tried to do, yeah? We argue that the process of sacralizing politics is not considerably affected by whether religious claims represents sincere commitment emanating from the religious convictions or is employed for political manipulation. The discourse and the use of religious claims becomes a defining feature of the state, and of course, in our case, of the colonial state. And the sacralized discourse gains an authority to justify state domination and much more than that. So sacralized politics, according to what we have said in our volume, is the practice of appealing to religious claims, religious texts, or religious belief to justify and legitimize states' policies, regardless of the political actors and regardless of whether they're secular or religious, yeah? In its various forms of political encounter with national, religious, or ethnic groups in the same homeland, the sacralization of politics serves to sanction the power of one group and establish not only its exclusive sovereignty, yeah, even in multi-ethnic states, but also its exclusive political authority and belonging to a homeland. The sacralization of politics helps understand the way religious or ethnic affiliation become a racialized marker of difference and not a signifier of a particular theological interpretation or just cultural difference. So here, you know, the stressing that it creates a matrix of power within which political life can be lived or articulated through racialized, religiously based national or ethnic affiliation. And therefore, it constructs discriminatory practices that can constitute an identity of privilege and the advantage that can then flow from it. So the deployment of racialized discourses of sacredness and its religious distinctions are there as we claim to reaffirm the politics of religious exclusivity. So sacralized politics, we argue, depends upon particular racialized narrations that frame some as others, confining them in spaces of indifference, whether the legal, the cultural, the geographic, the apartheid, the siege, and politically. Racialization in this case is an ongoing process reflected in structural relations of power, producing and maintaining the self and the other, be it on the non-Jew, the non-Hindu, the non-Protestant, whose political right can be then framed as violatable. Revealing the racialized contours of the sacralized politics and its governance and the management can also be shown how resistance to it becomes inevitable, yeah? Just notice what goes on today in Kashmir, what goes in occupied East Jerusalem, in Silwan, in Sheikh Jarrah, in southern Palestine, in the Naqab. So sacralization operates politically through numerous modes. Now, what we did is that we traced the matrix of power that sacralization of politics mobilizes. And when looking comparatively to the various case studies that we have examined in our volume, we pointed to three main, among really other modes of sacralization, yeah, and the way it impacts politics. The first mode was that operates through the management of consciousness, including the construction of self-identity in relation to others, yeah? We here refer to the construction of epistemological, hence the epistemic violence, and the politically and ideologically motivated perceptions and imagination that are embedded in religious claims to maintain the purity of the nation and its culture, and it is really very gendered, as we see in some chapters, yeah? In Tanika Sarkar's, for example, when talking about the Hindutva, it's religiously justified perception of chosenness or using religious text to legitimize political acts, even if, as we said, by seculars, yeah? Such processes engage the nation and its various communities in numerous interactions. It legitimates prejudice ideologies to support the privileges of one group against the other, and produces rationalizations, constructing a collective self that internalizes supremacy and exclusivity, justifying the privileges endorse it by the sacred and make it commonly narrated and socially and culturally shared. Yeah, narrations of exclusivity founded on sacralized accounts function to produce affects and affectual politics, patterns of acting, and modes of thinking that consolidate a collective self-perception of being chosen. This can help explain how and why individuals, communities, and states maintain a sense of even enriched conviction of that chosenness and, by definition, of entitlement to privileges and superiority over the others. The processes of narrating exclusivity and accumulating privileges develop with time and come to affect the individual and the collective self, as well as the belief system. What Professor Lloyd showed in his chapter on Northern Ireland, and he refers to Ulster's Unionist, what begins then as no more than identification with British social institutions develops into a constitutive claim to what Edward Said termed positional superiority, end of quote from David's chapter. In this sense, managing and regulating consciousness affects both the group, the dominant and the dominated. So construction of superior rights with the help of religious claims leads to portraying the dominated, their collective voice and their struggle in ways that serve the self-perceived moral superiority. The second mode is through territoriality and the politics. So if the first one was through consciousness and the control of the mind, the second one is through territoriality. And there, and the sacralization of the land. In this regard, we discern interrelated routes that characterized most cases of sacralized, say, territorial politics, and that have evident consequences for instigating interstate and intrastate conflict. The first is claiming the right to undertake territorial expansion at the expenses of the other in the name of a religious text or a religious tradition. Your work, Nadia, attests to this, yeah. The second, with potent implications for intergroup relations within the state, whether ethnic, religious, racial, lingual, and so on, endowing the land with some sort of sacredness. So in the first route, when we talk about territoriality, state can seek territorial expansion on religiously based claims. The case of Israel's territorial expansion is clear. On the second route of territorial politics is sacralizing land. State employs such claims not only for land seizure and territorial expansion, but also for excluding fellow citizens, ethnic, national, and religious groups. So sacralized ownership over land secure the dominance and exclusivity of one group over the other. Once the land gained the status of sacredness, or when the nation claiming the land sacralized the claim by relying on religious rhetoric, the way is open to regarding others, including fellow citizens, as strangers, as outsiders, as foreigner, as not one of us, as invaders, and even more than that. And the third element is the political governance via the use of necro-political regime and control. I would here, and here I connect it to demographic politics and to the economy of life and death. I don't want to go into more details. I want to take you to saying that while each mode operates separately, all operate through mutual reinforcement and each with elements of sacredness, resulting in an emergent power structure that is self-sustaining and resistant to change. And here I want to take you to occupied East Jerusalem and to what goes on today, because I'm speaking to you from the old city where the sacralization of politics is really hard at work. And here I want to end my intervention with a swift overview of our argument, or of my argument in the book, while sharing with you some, can you see it? Yeah. So this is the demolition in Silwan And you can see that this is the demolition. Of course, it's all in order to build a biblical garden. These are the parades that are done in order to maintain that narration, the narration of the biblical claim and the chosenness. And you can see here that in the old city around it, in the historic basin, in order to demolish the houses in the Silwan area. And this is all done with the help of the state. So the Minister of Justice, I'm looking at Nationalism and El-Haj that are working hard in Sheikh Jarrah today, where you see the attacks, the settlers' attacks, and in Silwan. So you see the Minister of Justice working, the Minister of Finance is supporting the Israeli Land Administration, the Jewish National Fund that is doing through greenwashing, ethnic cleansing, the Israeli Nature and Park Authority, the Israeli Antique, the Minister of Tourism, the Ministry of Transportation, and so on. And you see it clearly in your eyes where I talk about the occupation where the Star of David, this is Silwan area, and you see the flags and you see those small trains that are saying, showing the old Jerusalem. Of course, on the other side of this train, it's written, it all started here, so that the settlers biblically are thinking that they're entitled to the land. And of course, the excavation under Silwan, when some of the areas are really falling, causing, and the latest thing, which is what happened in the Yusfi graveyard, where they even flipped graveyards in order to claim and in order to turn it into a biblical claiming that it's biblically theirs. So what we see here is that the operating racial swarming, because it is swarming, it's the legal, it's the architecture, it's the it's the excavation. So it is this racial swarming via sacralized politics that activates structures and dynamics of power that entraps the colonized in a state of must disappear. Yeah, as Smith would say. And therefore, we see that I'tidal Abu Diab's house in Al-Bustan and in Baha Nababti, that the graveyard of her son in the Yusfi was turned. So analyzing occupied East Jerusalem as an example by the photos exposes a racialized, sacralized politics underlying Israel's state violence, modality of governance in light of a global regime of tolerance. And therefore, I totally support what David was saying, is that there is a need to push it strongly globally in order to challenge the sacralization of politics, because what happens today in Sheikh Jarrah and the performance of the biblical legal settler colonial mode demonstrates how the sacralized politics is essential in the violent governance of the Palestinian body and the Palestinian space and psychic, and in turn, the maintenance and reproduction of racialized Zionist politics. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to just really do some very brief comments to open a discussion, and then hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion amongst the panelists and then open to the Q&A. Clearly, I just want to begin by saying there's a lot that's been put on the table here about settler colonialism. There's a very interesting reading also in Nadim's essay about how the settler colonial paradigm rose and fell and re-rose in the context of scholarship on Palestine. There's the question of the comparison with Ireland and the peace process and exogamous pressure. I'm just going to touch on sort of the basic framing around religion and the sacred briefly, and then open the conversation. So I want to begin by saying this is a really ambitious collection of essays that sets out to think comparatively about the entanglement of nationalism and religious claims or the sacred. Most directly, it speaks against the presumption of nationalism as historically and definitionally secular, as Nadim laid out in his talk, by which the authors mean not religious. And I point that out because I'm going to come briefly to another way of thinking the secular here. And obviously, the challenge of the book is to think that non-binary with a particular focus on state power. So as Nadera pointed out here, the sincerity of the religious claims is not what is at stake here. So let me just quote briefly from the introduction written by Nadera and Nadim, quote, "State and world politics, when determined or framed by nationalism fused with religious claims, can provoke protracted conflict, infuse explicit religious beliefs and theories into politics and modes of governance, and legitimize the exclusion of groups, including fellow citizens, on the basis of interpreting sacred texts, and condone or instigate violence in the name of religiously embedded claims, unquote. They continue, and I quote again, "We define such politics as a religiously legitimated or framed politics of sacredness." So I want to just raise a few questions about this framing, or comment on and raise a few questions, obviously with a focus on Palestine. So in analyzing the Israeli state, both Nadera and Nadim, and I'm just going to focus on their chapters in introduction, insist on the fact that one cannot clearly separate the religious from the secular in the context of Zionism, not as a historical periodization. In other words, that there was a secular phase of Zionism from the founding of the state up until about the 1970s, not in terms of Israeli law, both the law of return, but also personal status law. One could argue that governs marriage. One cannot separate the religious from the secular, and not in terms of violence. That is, formal state violence is not distinct from explicitly and religiously articulated settler violence. The religious, in other words, is essential and constitutive of both state power and state legitimacy. And in writing her essay, which does many things, but Nader also begins by thinking about the border police invading Haram al-Sharif, and also writes about settlers carrying out price tag attacks in the West Bank. Let me quote, she shows how these structures and logics are mutually interdependent and reinforcing. So let me quote. "The combination of the invasion of sacred places on religious holidays and daily police military violence prompts me to examine the Jewish settlers' act of violence in light of sacralized politics. That is, an ideological religio-nationalist worldview that instigates the settlers' regime of governance, informing, shaping, and stirring legal, cultural, economic, spatial, and securitized interventions to control Palestinians in Jerusalem," unquote. In his article, Nadim lays out in more detail the religious grounding of the state. That is, only in turning to biblical accounts can Zionism have legitimized itself and can continue to legitimize itself as not being a settler colony. I want to emphasize this. The argument is that the religious claims to Palestine are crucial to recasting Zionism as a nation state and not a settler one. I completely agree with the larger argument and frame here, both in terms of what it means to cast Zionism as a nation state, as a distinct from a settler colony, and more generally, in terms of the impossibility of producing a hard dichotomy between the religious and the secular here as the non-religious, right? In relation to the history of Zionism in the Israeli state. And I completely agree again that the sensibility that this is a matter of return is crucial to saying it is not a matter of settlement. And it has been absolutely essential to casting Israel as something other than, for example, apartheid, or what Israel might have looked like if Zionists had settled in Uganda, as Nadim discussed. Nevertheless, I want to suggest a slightly different way of framing the distinctions and relationships among so-called secular versus so-called religious, and I mean that as self-described, secular versus religious Zionists. Let's start from a different understanding of the secular. If one follows Assad's foundational work here, which is obviously mentioned in the introduction, what we consider to be religion, and therefore the very distinction between the religious and the secular, emerges within secularism. That is, it speaks within a modern configuration of power and its attendant forms of rule that has a distinctly Christian genealogy. So born out of a complex history of the wars of religion, the rise of Protestantism, European colonial expansion, to reduce a complex genealogical argument to absurdity here, the secular neither sheds that Christian genealogy according to Assad, nor is it merely equivalent to it. In other words, the secular is not either really Christian or really religious if we just dug down deep enough, right? So in light of that, what is or was and is labor Zionism, or self-described secular Zionism's relationship to the religious? Is it a sacralization? Does it involve a sacralization of claims? So I just want to think here a little bit about reframing the sacralization language in terms of the relationship to the Bible. The Bible as history is not quite the same as the Bible as a sacred text, although I'm not arguing you completely separate those, right? That is, the sensibility towards the Bible and those stories and the kinds of investments in it are not the same. Zionism was not a settler colony precisely, described as, because of its ideology of return. But that return among so-called self-described secular Zionists was recast as historical fact rather than religious belief, right? One can think of either the archaeological artifacts and landscapes or the genetic markers I've thought about. So it's no longer a theological commitment per se, or even a commitment to the text's sacredness. At least it is not just that. It's a question of to what extent are the stories of national presence in ancient Palestine historically true, as you both know. In this configuration, then biblical justification becomes about dissent. And dissent can clearly be absent belief, not just sincere belief, but any belief. That is what is understood to characterize religion in the secular age. In other words, even if God does not exist, even if God did not hand the land to the Israelites or promised land, contemporary Jews are cast as indigenous precisely on the grounds of genealogical descent from an origin in Palestine. And of course, race theory completely tethered race to origins and geography. So I see here an echo, if not an isomorphism, to David's description of the settler triumphalism in Northern Ireland. And I quote from what he said earlier, settler mentality affected not of any kind of naturalization of religious difference as such, but of the use of religion fusing with the politics of settler nationalism in a structuring dominance. Religion has no meaning, and I'm still paraphrasing David, except in institutional forms put in place as a result of the partition, unquote. The secular then in this reading is neither the opposite of religion nor something invoked to legitimize Zionism as a nationalist project rather than a settler colony, right? The commitment is far deeper. In other words, perhaps this minor retweaking of your arguments gets us out of the either or, the secular, the religious, in a different way, and draws a continuity with religious Zionists without diminishing the distinctions of how each conceives of Zionism. One is a religious nationalist project in which the theological tradition is key, and one is a secular nationalist one in which the biblical, perhaps absent its sacredness, tells the tale of indigeneity and return, right? So I guess I'm just trying to think about whether ascribing a kind of language of the religious to labor Zionism and its relationship to the biblical text underplays a bit the power of the capacity to render the Bible history. And if we take that seriously, then there are still continuities, but we might get out of the religious secular dichotomy in a different way. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, so then I finally just want to raise the question. There seems to be an assumption that nationalisms, when merged with the religious, are more virulent and potentially dangerous. Maybe that's true in the contemporary world, right? And I'll quote here, a fusion of religion and nationalism is likely to generate greater violence and willingness on behalf of individuals to sacrifice themselves in the name of the collective. That's from the intro. I'm not sure that that's necessarily sustainable on empirical grounds, right? Nazism, Khmer Rouge, the Rwandan genocide. But I wonder then the role that sacralization as a word and the sacred is playing here. And at times, it really seems to be saying that the sacralization marks that which is more deeply unquestionable, right? That, of course, falls into precisely the kind of secularism and the discourse of secularism that Assad himself lays out and critiques. And I guess I'm just left with a query whether I really, about whether there obviously haven't been and aren't forms of nationalism or white supremacy that are equally unquestionable and equally virulent that don't rely on invoking the sacred, right? And I know on the one hand, you're not mapping it one-to-one, but I worry a bit about the work that word is doing insofar as it plays into the presumption that religious commitments or religious nationalist commitments are inherently more dangerous. There's certainly indications of white nationalism in the US today, where the Christian may be a slightly empty category, except as a kind of racial identity claim, right? Which are deeply deeply dangerous. So anyway, I just wanted to end there and then really open up the conversation, which in light of both the book that I read through and your comments is incredibly rich here. So maybe I will stop.
Thank you, Nadia, and that these are very important comments. And I'll take one of them because of the limitation of time. I would say, yes, I mean, the question of labor Zionism as secular, it certainly doesn't have the religious in the theological meaning. It's not there. You don't see it there. Actually, some of them were atheists. But at the same time, the legitimacy came from the biblical story. Now, you're saying you're making the differentiation between the Bible as history and the Bible as a sacred text. Incidentally, this is a side point. In Israeli curricula and schools and so on, the Bible is taught in many cases as history, and but this doesn't apply to labor Zionism. I would say yes. I mean, they are entitled to look at it as, but when they say we don't believe in God, but God gave us this land, it doesn't matter if it's theological or historical. How is the claim that God gave us this land that you find all over labor Zionism and secular Zionism, that I don't know, they are non-believers, but God gave the land. So after all, the legitimacy comes from that source, from the deity, right? The other thing is that I personally am not in any position to deny the Jewish historical connection to the land. I just think that Jews have historical connection to Palestine, right? This is my personal view. But I would resist the transformation of that historical connection, or even if you want religious connection, to political right, to legitimacy. I mean, the whole question of genealogy and descent and so on, I mean, that's a question that I don't know if modern, if we want to go into there, if people start to claim lands in which they did have existence 2,000 years ago, if that makes any sense whatsoever. At the same time, the connection is there and should be respected, and and was respected before Zionism, should be respected. But the transformation of that into the political, and actually into the political as as expressed in settler colonialism, but even without that, is the illegitimate part in my mind.
I guess what I'm just saying is, I think that there have been very powerful iterations of that origin claim that never said, God gave us a land. God doesn't exist, God gave us a land, right? I mean, in archaeological practice and the history that gets written out of it, in the genetic stuff I've looked at, the argument, God doesn't enter the discussion. The question is the historical claim of Jewish origin, is the biblical claim of Jewish origins in Palestine, and for archaeology, a state, is it something that one can verify historically? In other words, is it historically true? And then you can create a narrative of a nations, right? Nationalism relied on a sense that we were the original inhabitants, right? Now, the difference, of course, is the establishment of continuity. But I just mean that there were ways of reading that history and turning it into a claim that was equivalent to other nationalist historical claims, the imagined nation, right, of Benedict Anderson, without, in fact, having to invoke God at all. You could set God to the side and say, but look, we find evidence. So yes, I think both of those things exist at the same time. There is no God, God gave us the land, but I think there's another and more complex historical project that tries to shed the origin genealogical of any reference to God. And they all work together.
Yeah, because in one sentence, I mean, that the question if historically that's true or not, in my mind, has no relationship to the legitimacy of taking over Palestine, but the way.
Of course, I'm not.
But
I'm not saying it's any more.
Yeah, it can make a story. That's fine. But I think you're right that story might be a story without invoking God or his relationship and promises and so on. Anyway, yeah, very important.
David, did you want to say? David was trying.
I defer to you for now, Nadera.
Yeah, thank you really, Nadia, for your very important comments. And I think that you take us to a different place in looking at the sacralization of politics and what we mean by sacralized politics. We engaged with discussions related to the, secular versus religious and so on. We engaged with even scholars that were defining sacralization, for example, Gentile, when he's talking on fascism and Mussolini, but our own use of when politics are sacralized is there to talk more about the violence of the state, to talk more about the legitimation of violence via the use of biblical claims and the claim of chosenness, and so on, and then the activation of law and the activation of dispossession of land and so on. So we did not go into the questions that you have raised that much, because what we have looked at is how when politics was sacralized, state gained more power, state used biblical claims to dispossess people of their rights, to legitimate its violence. And that religious legitimation is what really we worried about. And one of the contributors of our our volume really talks about how lots of settlers that came that were secular, yet God gave them the land. So it's not that black and white, it's that assemblage of powers and sacralized powers that played to the hand of the Zionists here in Palestine. And the question of looking at it or secular or religious is problematic because it goes beyond that. It requires us to really look at and to look at what goes on in the laws, in the planning, in the demography, in biopolitics, in so on, in what is happening now in Sheikh Jarrah, when Ben Gvir, who is clearly talking with the language of the Bible as not only historical, but also a religious rights. And what we're saying is that look at what happens to the violence and the legitimation of violence and state power that is increasing when politics is sacralized. So the sacralization of politics is taking a bit different meaning, although we do engage with the various claims.
Mm-hmm. Okay, David, do you want to jump in? And then I want to pull after that, just some questions.
Well, just very quickly, since there are some questions in the chat. What I'm curious about is the dynamic, to go back to Nadim's early comments, that generates a more virulent claim to sacred entitlements. I mean, this is utterly preposterous, but it's somehow symptomatic that loyalists in Northern Ireland actually invented them for themselves a parallel to Zionism by claiming that they actually were descended from an original population of Ireland that had been kicked out to Scotland and returned when the Scottish plantations took place in the 17th century. So that they've invented this, and many loyalists absolutely believe it to be the case and are even learning Irish because that would have been the language they would have spoken. So in a certain sense, what happened in Northern Ireland, I think, was that, first of all, a liberal unionism that laid claim to Protestantism as a kind of civic expression was largely displaced in the course of the Troubles by a more radical loyalism, which laid claim to a more religious Protestantism that really expressed itself, however, more in secular images than in actual religious claims. And really, it's the sacralization of politics seems to me the moment where myths of this kind take over from religion as an institutional form. So what I would suggest is and ask about is whether in fact what's happening with Zionism is the mythologization of its religion in its attachment to land, rather than a historical claim for the genealogy of that religion. So I don't know, but that would certainly be the lesson I would draw from the rather preposterous myths that developed in Ireland.
Thanks, David. Actually, I'm sorry. A question that really pulled some of this discussion together, including David's final comments. This is from a graduate of art in my department. I may not have fully understood Nadim's comments, but I was wondering if he could elaborate a bit more on the what if Uganda scenario and why that might have been different for religious Zionist claims. European settlers in the United States mobilized religious claims, manifest destiny. Wouldn't Zionism have found a way to legitimize itself similarly?
This is a very, very important question. I want to give you an incident. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister, went to visit Uganda. You know, I don't know if you know about this incident, and the president told him he confused Israel with Palestine, was incoherent and so on, but he told him, I'm happy you didn't come here because we would have been fighting you until now. I think Hadil, her name, is right that that settler colonialism did use religious rhetoric, that's for sure. In most of these cases, we find that. But I would encourage us to look at what is it that modern, settler colonialism today, what is the legitimation? I mean, settler colonialism today, including in this country, is dealing with issues of democracy and equality and, you know, de-racializing, and with the Native Americans, with the Indian Americans, it's still dealing with that. But I don't think that Zionism would have a way. Well, I'm going to say something that might be heard controversial. I think in the massive presence of Palestinians in Palestine and all over Palestine, I don't think that Zionism has that opportunity, because if Zionism talks about democracy, you see, even when they talk about democracy, Nadia, they talk, as you know, they talk about Jewish democracy. It's not democracy, it's Jewish democracy. It's not the land of, it's not the state of its citizens, it's the state of the Jewish people, the nationality law and so on. I don't think Zionism could have gone through that transformation to where other modern settler colonial regimes, Australia and this country, are grappling with many problems, of course.
Thank you. So since we're getting close to needing to end, I'm going to read one more question from a colleague, Leila Balogh. So, I have two kinds of questions. I'd love to hear more about the separation you sometimes make between religion and politics, as if religion was a legitimizing of political power. By thinking about another point from Talal Asad, he talks about Islam as a discursive tradition within which argument occurs. Could we think about Judaism as a discursive tradition within which arguments about right practice are made? And so that makes us recognize that even though there are seculars and religious, they are arguing within this tradition. I find the arguments Nadera made about the institutions and Nadim about the processes involved crucial and more powerful than questions about religion. But my second question was how this project might have been influenced by the debates about ISIS and the use of religion for violence. Okay. There we go. Who wants to give this a shot?
Well, thank you again for the question. I guess that the issue is not the religious. the element of the religion, and therefore, Islam, Judaism is not the issue. I guess that what we are talking about is exactly the sacralization, which is turning it into something sacred, which is turning it to something that nobody can challenge. So if God gave someone the land, how can we challenge God? So the question is not religion per se, Christianity, Judaization, or it's the way it is used by the state to legitimize violence, to dispossess, and to cause and to harm. And therefore, I think that if I understood Leila's question properly, is that, whether the institutions that are here being activated, or whether the process of dispossession that is happening here in Zionism, it's used differently. In Zionism, when I look at, for example, unchilding, and I see how in other settler colonial contexts, children were put in places, or as in Canada or in Australia and other places, over here, children are not even defined as children. They're defined as terrorists, as criminal, as born criminal, and so on. So I guess Zionism and the use of the sacralization of politics and the use and abuse, I would say, of biblical texts and religion is there to legitimize violence and the settler colonial violence, and turning it into really a structure that is constantly being activated by the different institutions. So I hope that I'm addressing well, and this is where the racialization of this sacred sacralized politics, because it's really Fanonian in so many ways.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take one last question from the audience because I think that's about the time we have. So it's from someone, Crystal Shackelford. Israel benefits from framing their claims as secular or religious, but to the extent that Palestinian claims are framed as religious, this enables both Israel and many in the West to dismiss Palestinian grievances. What do you make of this asymmetry? Is it just because the conflation of Islam and Palestinians allows Israel to bind their cause with the war on terror, or is there more to it? And I have to say, I pulled out that question because I see it sort of, although that doesn't mean that's how you have to, really linking up to, I think, Leila's insight about what work we could do with the notion of a discursive tradition, but I could say a word or two about that afterwards. Let me give it.
If quickly about that, we have a chapter in the book about Palestine. And I don't think if this will be surprising to anybody, the Palestinian national movement did not use religious text to legitimize its indigenous claim to Palestine. They used indigeneity and, being the people of the land. Hamas does use that. Hamas, according to the chapter in our book, reduced that rhetoric. And Hamas, according to that chapter and to my understanding, used the religious rhetoric to recruit for resistance more than to claim the land. But that doesn't answer the question really, and there's no symmetry. There's no symmetry also in the claim because of what I said about Palestinian claims based not on religion, except for Hamas case that uses religion really more to encourage resistance. But the response of the international community is in the expected direction of the question, I would say.
I would also say clearly that you cannot compare the two cases, and I think that clear in Khalid al-Hurub's chapter, it's clear that the Hamas have used religious claims in relation to resistance, but not, and the Palestinian liberation power right at the onset never used religious claims in the same manner as calling and turning the people as chosen, or calling for violence and so on. So I think that the comparison is really problematic, and we need to remember that resistance is part of the right of the colonized to react. So it's a normal reaction to extreme violence that we have seen in the Zionist settler colonial regime.
I would just add one comment to both of you, who absolutely, and you know more about this than I do, but I would also say that just to address the asymmetry that the question is the asymmetry in reception. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, casting this as a kind of battle between Israel and radical Islam is something that the Israeli state really made an effort to reframe their problem, particularly after 9/11, but not just then, you know, starting in the late 70s. But I also think what's interesting is that those are asymmetrical claims, not, and I mean sort of epistemologically or politically, not just because, you know, the ways in which Islamic politics of any sort is dismissed as mere terror. But this is sort of a different way of thinking of that Laila's question about the discursive tradition. There's a certain now kind of Judeo-Christian sensibility that this really is the homeland of the Jews historically, right? And that I think has become such a common sense that the claims become asymmetrical, because one is about really returning to a homeland supposedly, and one is about disrupting that right. So I think in that sense, the idea that one is part of a shared argument that relates to this biblical tradition and these biblical texts, but that can have different configurations as a sort of historical sensibility. In other words, Nadim, your point of like, even if it were true, what difference does it make, is not easily accepted in the West, right?
Yes,
exactly. So that's the thing that I would just add to the asymmetry, is it's at a fundamental argument. I mean, a fundamental level of what one takes to be epistemologically valid versus invalid. Okay, so since we need to
thank you,
any, yeah, please. Any final comments from our panelists who have done a wonderful job for us? Or should we just say thank you?
Thank you for everybody. These are very important questions, and this is a discussion that has to be continued one way or another, but these are important questions. Thank you all.
I hope this will be the beginning of a series of events rather than the culminating one. So thank you all very much.
Yes. I want to thank the panelists so much, both for doing this session with us and for the book, which is really quite, we have not even touched the surface of how ambitious this book is here. And I also, because I forgot at the beginning, want to thank ICPRL for co-sponsoring this. And hopefully we will be able to host you all again, maybe even in person someday soon. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye. Thank you.
Take care.